The laptop is open on the kitchen table, and the propane lantern is throwing enough light to see by. The image on the screen is dated the 14th of September 2023. Time-stamped 2:47 in the morning. A shape stands at the edge of the maple grove, well inside the tree line, oriented directly toward the east wall of the cabin. The kitchen window is in that east wall. Gary was asleep in the sleeping loft on September 14th. He got up at 5:45 that morning, made coffee on the propane stove, and sat in the same chair where he is sitting right now, with no idea what had been standing outside in the dark, facing the window above the sink. He scrolls to September 21st. The shape is there again, closer this time, maybe 18 feet from the same wall, in the same posture, facing the same window. He keeps scrolling. He stops counting appearances and starts counting instead the nights he slept in this cabin while it stood outside watching. My name is Gary Bowen, 58 years old, living in Newberry, Michigan. I spent 22 years as a wildlife technician with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources out of the Newberry Field Office in Luce County. I retired in the spring of 2019, early by design, because the pension math worked out, and because the 80 acres my father left me had been waiting long enough for more of my attention than I could give them from a state vehicle doing road surveys every other morning. Before the fall of 2023, who I am matters for how I interpreted what I found. I am not a person who invents explanations and works backward to justify them. 22 years doing field work for a state agency builds a particular discipline. You record what you observe. You measure what you can measure. You compare what you find to what is known about the species in your region, and when something does not fit the known patterns, you say so, rather than bending the observation to fit a comfortable conclusion. That discipline is what I applied to those cameras. It is also what left me without an explanation. A wildlife technician in the field is not the same job as a wildlife biologist at a desk. For 22 years, I was the person doing the physical work that backed up the population models and management decisions. Deer spotlight surveys along transect routes on county roads ran through Luce, Mackinac, and Schoolcraft counties, recording species, number, and location data along established routes. Population monitoring for fisher, marten, and mink involved trap lines across remote sections of the UP in cooperation with registered trappers, tagging animals, and contributing to long-term harvest data. Winter track surveys on snowshoe-covered wolf and lynx sign across the eastern UP, reading snow surface evidence for what had moved through, in what direction, and whether the animal was traveling, resting, or hunting. Road-killed animals generated tissue samples for disease monitoring. Aerial moose surveys in the eastern UP ran during winter, when the animals were visible against snow cover from a fixed-wing aircraft. I know what animals leave behind when they move through a landscape. A large black bear in November mud leaves a track of a specific shape and a specific depth relative to the animal's body weight. Wolf tracks can be distinguished from a large domestic dog by the proportions of the toes and the spread of the metacarpals. White-tailed deer running on frozen ground leave a movement pattern that differs from the same deer walking in soft soil. I learned to read those differences over 22 years, and I was accurate enough at it that my supervisors were comfortable citing my track identifications in published reports. That accuracy does not come from casual observation. It comes from thousands of hours matching evidence to known species and being corrected until your error rate becomes acceptable to people whose credibility depends on yours. The baseline I was comparing it to was built from 2 decades of professional fieldwork, not from wildlife documentaries and general familiarity. I know what belongs in a northern Michigan forest in the fall, including the upper end of the size range for every species that lives there, and what an animal at the outer limit of normal looks like on a calibrated camera. What appeared on my cameras in the fall of 2023 was not at the outer limit of normal. The 80 acres sit in a remote corner of Luce County, about 14 miles northeast of Newberry on a 2-track, accessed from a county road. I will not identify specifically. The eastern boundary of the property runs along the edge of the Hiawatha National Forest. My father, Walter Bowen, bought the land from a timber company in 1974, after they had finished cutting the merchantable pine and moved on to the next parcel. He paid $11 an acre for logged-over cutover, which was the going rate for cutover land in the central Upper Peninsula in those years. and he paid in 2 installments from money he had saved from 15 years of work at a box factory in Newbury. He was not a man who talked about what things cost him, but from the way he occasionally mentioned those 80 acres, I understood that buying that land was among the things he was most proud of in his life. Not because of its value, because it was his, and no one could take it. He built the cabin himself in 1978 with help from my Uncle Earl, who did concrete and masonry work out of Manistee and could frame a structure, as well as any licensed carpenter I have worked alongside. The cabin is 16 by 20 feet of cedar log, with a sleeping loft accessed by a fixed ladder, a propane cook stove, a Fisher wood stove for heat, and a hand pump over the kitchen sink that draws from a sand point. Well, my father drove himself. The October he built the place, he used a fence post driver and a set of pipe couplings and a steel drive point, and worked down through 22 feet of sand and gravel to the aquifer. He checked the water in the first week, and it came up clear and cold, and has stayed that way for 45 years. There is no electrical hookup, and there never has been. He said a cabin with a power line runs the same as a house, and the point of having a cabin was that it operated differently than a house. I have kept that principle intact in the years since the property came to me. My father started hunting the property the winter before the cabin was finished, going in on snowshoes when there was snow, and sleeping in a canvas wall tent when there was not. He took me the first time I was old enough to carry a rifle steadily, which was 9 in his judgment, the fall of 1974. I shot my first ruffed grouse on the dirt road out front that October with a 2.0 gauge single shot that was too long for my arms. The bird fell into a pile of dry leaves, and I spent what felt like several minutes hunting it on my hands and knees, while my father stood 10 feet away and watched. My father could have pointed to the bird at any moment, and chose not to. Finding it was my job. That was the kind of teacher he was, and the discipline of looking carefully at what is in front of you before deciding what it means is something he gave me that first grouse season, and that I have carried into every kind of work I have done since. He hunted the property for nearly 40 years. My father died in March of 2014, lung cancer, diagnosed the previous September, and moving faster than the doctors initially projected. The property came to me in his will with a handwritten letter requesting that the timber not be harvested and that the cabin not be sold out of the family. I have honored both. The second growth forest has come back well in the half-century since the logging company left. That northeast quarter is now mature maple and yellow birch with a canopy that closes completely in summer. Along the north drainage, dense balsam fir and spruce provide thermal cover that the deer use through the coldest weather. The southwest section, which was the logging company's equipment staging area, is still open ground, grass, and young aspen, and it is the best deer food source on the property in early fall when the acorns have not yet dropped from the oaks along the south property line. My father knew every part of that property the way you can only know a piece of ground by hunting it for 4 decades, and I have spent another 4 decades building on what he knew. Trail cameras went up on the property in 2015, after enough years of wondering what was moving through at night that I finally bought cameras to get answers. The first season confirmed what I had suspected. There were mature bucks using the property regularly through October and November that I had essentially no daytime exposure to. After that first year, I expanded to 5 cameras and developed the placement system I have refined over 9 seasons. All 5 units are cut-back long-range IR cameras. I settled on that brand after trying 2 other manufacturers whose units had mechanical failure rates that made them impractical for remote deployment where I am not checking on them frequently. The cut-back trigger speed is approximately a quarter second, which matters for catching animals mid-stride through a clearing, and the IR flash carries about 80 feet, which matters for my layout because some of the best camera positions on my property are at the far end of open ground, where a shorter flash gives you nothing useful. Each camera is set to 30-second video clips with a 5-second delay between triggers. Each clip is stamped with the time, date, and ambient temperature at the moment of trigger, logged by a thermistor built into the camera housing. Cut-back specs list the thermistor accuracy at plus or minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature stamp is relevant to this situation in a specific way I will get to shortly. Camera 1 is on a maple about 60 feet inside the east property line, facing across the open clearing toward the cabin. That position catches animals entering from the national forest to the east and moving into the clearing. From that angle, the east wall of the cabin is visible in the lower right background of the frame at a distance of roughly 140 feet from the lens. I placed that camera there because the clearing between the east tree line and the cabin is the primary crossing route for deer moving from the national forest toward the south meadow, and the camera angle covers that crossing while also showing a wide section of the clearing. Camera 2 sits at the south end of the meadow at a scrape and rub line the bucks have maintained for at least 8 consecutive seasons. The third camera is on a spruce at the north end of the creek drainage, facing upstream toward the beaver pond, covering a pinch between the bank and a blowdown tangle that funnels deer movement through a narrow gap. Up on a ridge birch about 40 feet above and east of the cabin, camera 4 is angled down into the splitwood clearing and the meadow edge, where deer graze after dark in September and early October. Camera 5 is on the west 2-track entry, angled to catch movement across the old skid road near the property corner. In mid-August 2023, I drove out to open camp and put the cameras up. 2 days of work, mostly road clearing. A birch had come down over the winter at the culvert crossing and taken part of a spruce with it. After I got the 2-track clear, I checked the cabin, repacked a section of chinking above the west window, replaced weather stripping on the east door, cleaned up mouse sign on the kitchen counter. Then I walked the camera positions, loaded fresh lithium batteries into each unit, formatted the cards, confirmed settings, and drove back to Newberry. I did not return for 3 weeks. Between mid-August and October, I was in Newberry doing the things that make up retirement when you have let yourself stop filling every available hour. Dorothy and I put up the garden produce. The south-facing trim on the house got a fresh coat. A load of firewood went to my daughter's place in Marquette. My neighbor Jerry Vance needed help sorting out a hydraulic problem on his skidder that had been on his list since spring and required 2 people to do properly. Jerry is a good deer hunter and has hunted this part of the UP his whole life. He has been on my property twice, in years when I invited him in for the opening week of firearm season, and he knows the east clearing and the cabin's position in it. I say that because Jerry is someone I ended up calling later in this process, after I had looked at all the images and run out of explanations on my own. I drove out to the property for 2 card checks during the August-September period. Both times I pulled the full cards, put fresh ones in, and took the full cards home and loaded them onto my laptop without doing a thorough review. I had looked at enough of the early September card from camera 3 to know there was good buck activity in the north drainage, and I had seen the bear on the east side, but I had not gone carefully through camera 1's images or the ridge camera images. A long sitting with nothing else competing for my attention is how I prefer to do the full review, and I kept putting it off until I had that time. Archery opener was October 7th, and I drove out that morning. The first week of October is one I consistently skip on this property because pressure on the adjacent Hiawatha land pushes deer into unpredictable patterns, and waiting for the second week consistently gives me more settled movement. I got there in the morning, aired the cabin, built a fire in the fissure, and hunted that afternoon. A doe and 2 fawns at the south meadow edge at last light. Nothing else. I made dinner and went to bed in the loft. I hunted the following 2 days and had deer moving, but nothing that made me reach for an arrow. On the morning of October 9th, I walked out to cameras 1, 3, and 4 and pulled their cards. Walked back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon, ran the generator cord through the kitchen window, and sat down with the accumulated images I had been putting off reviewing. The 3 days I had hunted before sitting down at the table had been ordinary October days on that property. Good days by most measures, not eventful by the standards of what October on that land can produce. I was hunting from a fixed ladder stand in the maple grove near the southeast corner of the property, where a trail coming south from the creek drainage crosses a shooting lane through the timber. It is a stand I have used for 12 years and positioned based on knowledge of the deer routes that took years to accumulate. On October 7th, I sat from before first light until 8 in the morning, and then again from 3 in the afternoon until dark, which is the standard schedule I keep in early October when the deer are not yet moving intensively in daylight. I had deer movement on that first morning, a group of does before sunrise, and I passed on them because the season was early and I was looking for something with antlers. The afternoon was quiet. October 8th was similar. I had a small buck, a spike, come through the shooting lane at 7 in the morning, and I watched him for a few minutes and passed. The afternoon was cold and windy, and I did not see anything. October 9th, I moved to a ground blind near the south meadow edge for the morning hunt, and watched a doe with 2 fawns work the far side of the meadow for nearly an hour. They were relaxed, feeding, completely normal in their behavior. There was nothing in the way those animals moved through the morning that suggested anything unusual on the property. Deer, in the presence of a disturbing stimulus, behave differently. They ghost in and out quickly. They stay edgy. They flick their ears constantly and stop frequently to look and scent. These animals were calm and deliberate. They had no idea anything was wrong with the property, or nothing felt wrong to them in the October morning daylight. Later I would think about those deer, calm in the meadow on October 9th morning, and about what the cameras had recorded on October 2nd at 2:23 a.m. Those two things would not fit into any single picture of what was happening on my property. If a large unknown animal had been moving through the east, clearing and approaching the cabin repeatedly across 5 weeks, you would expect the deer using that same clearing to show signs of elevated alertness. A trail camera that catches deer acting skittish, bunching up, stopping frequently, leaving the clearing abruptly, is often telling you that something else is using that space regularly. My deer showed nothing like that in any of Camera 1's clips from the August and September period. They crossed the clearing the same way they always cross it, relaxed and deliberate, not varying their routes or their pace. The shape in the Camera 1 clips appeared after most of the deer activity in the clearing had already occurred for that night. In the August 28th clip, the deer had been through the clearing hours earlier. The shape arrived at 2:14 a.m., when the clearing was otherwise empty. The same was true for every subsequent clip on Camera 1. Whatever this thing was doing in the east, clearing between 2 and 4 in the morning, it was doing it in the dark, when the clearing was quiet, and the deer were not aware of it, or were not reacting to it the way they react to a predator. I do not know what that means. A deer's reaction to a predator on camera is well-documented behavior I have seen many times. Calm. Deer look completely different. My deer were calm. Camera 3 was normal and informative. Good buck activity in the north drainage. A mature 8-point I had records of from 2022, still using the same creek crossing. A smaller buck with a broken brow tine, new to my catalog this year. The bear at the beehive, a coyote pair feeding on a kill across 2 consecutive late September nights. I spent about an hour on Camera 3 and noted what I needed for hunting decisions. Then, Camera 1. Camera 1 had normal deer crossing activity through most of August. The black bear on August 22nd and 2 following nights. 4 doe groups in the clearing, all moving east to west, National Forest to South Meadow. A pair of otters on August 25th that surprised me, because otter's sign on that drainage was something I had not documented before. All normal. Then the clip from August 28th. The timestamp was 2:14 a.m. The first 6 seconds of the clip showed the empty clearing with the cabin in the lower right background of the frame. Then movement appeared at the left edge of the frame, inside the east tree line, approximately 80 feet from the camera. The movement stopped. It stood still for the remaining 24 seconds of the clip, upright and large. The IR flash showed me the outline of a head, a torso, and arms hanging at its sides. At the end of the 30 seconds, it had not moved. The delay timer cycled, and there were no further triggers. The next image on that card was from 6:03 the following morning. A deer at the north end of the clearing. I watched the August 28th clip 4 times. My first thought was bear. A black bear standing upright at 80 feet in IR flash is a large upright silhouette, and that is essentially what I had. But the proportions were wrong for a bear in 2 specific ways. A bear standing on its hind legs holds its front paws elevated and away from the body for balance, a posture that reads clearly in IR even at distance. This shape had its arms straight down at its sides, hanging. A standing bear cannot hang its forelimbs straight down because the anatomy of the shoulder does not allow that posture, and the head was wrong. A bear skull from the front, when the animal is upright, is wide and broad, distinctly so. This head was taller than it was wide, and it sat on a neck that was clearly differentiated from the shoulders, which a bear's head does not do when the animal is upright, because the neck is short and the head sits close to the shoulder line. My second thought was a person, someone crossing from the national forest without tracking the property line, stopping when the camera triggered. I have had trespassers before. The line is marked with paint blazes, and people do not always respect paint blazes at 2 a.m. I filed that under the reasonable column and kept going through September. September 7th, 3:1 a.m. Same left edge of frame, this time approximately 60 feet from the camera. Same upright profile, same arm position, same narrow head shape. 30 seconds, no movement. September 14th, 2:47 a.m. Approximately 40 feet. September 21st, 3:12 a.m. Approximately 25 feet. Right at the inner margin of the tree line. September 28th, 2:58 a.m. Stepping out of the tree line into the edge of the clearing, roughly 15 to 20 feet from the lens. I use a 3/6-inch orange-tipped lath staked in front of each camera as a size reference. By September 21st, the shape was close enough to the lens and in a clear enough position that I could use the geometry of the tree spacing behind it and the camera angle to estimate its height with reasonable reliability. I ran the calculation 3 ways, checking against trees whose positions I know from 40 years on that property and against the camera's field of view characteristics as specified in the owner's manual. All 3 calculations gave me a result between 6 feet 11 inches and 7 feet 4 inches. That is consistent enough across 3 independent methods to treat as a reliable estimate. The arms were visible clearly at the shorter distances from the September 21st clip onward, straight down from the shoulders, hanging, completely still. The hands were below mid-thigh. My own hands at rest hang at the top of the thigh. This shape's hands were several inches below the midpoint of the upper leg. I know human body proportion from a career that involved estimating the size of animals from their tracks and from photographs, and I know the normal range of human arm length relative to standing height. These arms were outside that range on the long end, significantly outside it. The temperature on the September 28th clip was logged by the camera as 31 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:58 a.m. At 31 degrees, a warm-blooded animal of significant body mass produces visible breath vapor. I have been outdoors at those temperatures more nights in my life than I could count, and I know exactly what exhalation looks like in IR on a camera at 20 feet. The September 28th clip showed nothing, not in the first 10 seconds, not in the last 10 seconds. No trace of vapor across the full 30 seconds of the clip, in 3:1 degree air, from a shape with the body volume of a large adult male. The October 2nd clip, 2:23 a.m., temperature stamp, reading 34 degrees. The shape was in the open clearing, standing 7 feet from the east wall of the cabin. From that position, facing the east wall directly, it had an unobstructed line of sight through the kitchen window to the interior of the cabin. 7 feet from that window in 3-4 degree air, completely motionless, no visible exhalation, at 2:23 in the morning. I had driven out for the season, 5 days after that image was recorded. I sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. The lantern was on above the sink. I turned it off and stood at the kitchen window until my eyes adjusted to the dark. The clearing was empty. That dark wall of the east tree line sat roughly 140 feet out, and the ridge above the cabin was black against a sky with some cloud cover. Nothing moved. I stood at that window for longer than was necessary, and then went back to the table. I pulled up camera 4, the ridge camera, angled down the east slope toward the splitwood clearing. At the oblique angle of its field of view, the camera has a partial view of the cabin's east wall and roofline from above. September 9th, triggered at 2:51 a.m., a shape on the slope partway up the rise above the cabin, upright, facing downslope toward the structure. September 16th, same position on the ridge, 3:08 a.m. September 23rd, slightly lower on the slope, closer to the east corner of the cabin, 2:44 a.m. October 1st, on the lower slope directly above the woodshed, 2:17 a.m. 4 more appearances. The same shape working its way down the ridge above the cabin from two directions simultaneously over 5 weeks, getting closer from the east and from above. I went back through the early September card pull that I had not fully reviewed and found one more clip on camera, one from August 31st at 3:24 a.m., the shape at the east tree line at approximately 80 feet. That brought the total to 11. 11 appearances across 5 weeks, all between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., all on the two cameras with sightlines to the cabin. Nothing anomalous on the two cameras facing away from it, getting closer from the east and from the ridge above, on a schedule that had nothing random about it. Past midnight at that table, I went through all 11 clips in order, from August 28th through October 2nd, in the dark with the laptop the only light in the cabin. The lantern stayed off. Outside the kitchen window, the clearing was quiet, and the tree line was there at the east edge, and the ridge was above. The camera cards from October 9th were the most recent images I had. The cameras had been running for the 6 days since I arrived. I would not know what they had captured during that period until I pulled the cards again. What I already knew was that for 5 weeks while the cabin sat empty in August and September, and into October, something had been coming out of the national forest at night and moving toward this cabin, growing closer on a predictable schedule, and stopping 5 days before I arrived. The last image showed it 7 feet from the east wall, facing the kitchen window where I had been sitting for the past several hours in the dark. I went outside. I put my boots on and took the flashlight from the shelf by the door and went out the front door of the cabin, around the west side past the woodshed, and stopped at the east wall. The air was in the mid-30s, clear now, with stars showing where the cloud cover had broken. I stood at the east wall and turned around, so I was facing the clearing, the same direction the shape in the October 2nd clip had been facing. 7 feet from the wall. I turned around and looked at the kitchen window from the outside. The window is approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The original single-pane glass my father installed in 1978. At night, with the lantern off, there was nothing to see through it from outside. The cabin interior was dark, and the glass just reflected the clearing and the tree line and the sky. But in the October 2nd clip at 2:23 a.m., taken from camera 1 at 140 feet to the west of the shape, with the shape 7 feet from the east wall, the shape had been standing with a direct line of sight to this window. And in the clip, whatever was inside this window that the shape was oriented toward, it had held its attention for a full 30 seconds, without any movement at all. I pointed the flashlight at the window and turned it on. The beam caught the glass and reflected back. I moved the flashlight off to the angle and saw into the cabin interior through the window, the kitchen table, the wood stove, the ladder up to the loft, all the ordinary contents of the space. There was nothing in that window worth watching for 30 seconds. Nothing that would explain standing in 3-4 degree air without moving. Facing this window, in the middle of the night, I walked out to the east tree line. The distance from the east wall to the tree line is approximately 140 feet across the clearing, and I walked it in the dark, with the flashlight pointed down. The soil in the clearing in mid-October is still soft in the spots that do not drain well, and the area near the center of the clearing holds moisture from the low ground. I got to the tree line and turned on the flashlight and looked at the ground just inside the first row of trees, where the August 28th clip had shown the shape standing. The ground there is a mix of decomposing leaf litter and exposed root systems and occasional patches of exposed soil. I did not find any tracks in the leaf litter. I would not necessarily expect to. Leaf litter does not hold a track the way mud does. I did find one section of exposed moist soil near the base of the maple where the camera was mounted. A bare patch, maybe a foot square, and it was undisturbed. Nothing had stood on that patch recently. I walked back to the cabin, went inside, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a few more minutes before turning the lantern back on. I called Jerry Vance at 11:40 that night. He answered on the third ring, which told me he was still up, which is normal for Jerry in October. I told him I had found something on my cameras that I could not account for, and asked if he would be willing to look at the images the following day. He said yes without asking questions, which is also normal for Jerry. He has known me long enough to understand that I do not make that kind of call unless the reason for it is real. I slept in the loft that night, with the window in the east gable open 2 inches, The way I always sleep in the cabin in October, because the fresh air is part of what I come out here for. I lay in the dark and listened to the clearing below. The wind was calm. The temperature was in the mid-30s. It was quiet in the way the Upper Peninsula is quiet at midnight in October. Not silent, because nothing in the woods is truly silent at any hour. But the sounds were the ones that belonged there. I did not hear anything that did not belong. I had no way of knowing what was outside. Eventually, I slept. Jerry Vance arrived at the cabin at 9 the next morning, a Saturday. He drove out from his place on County Road 500, which is about 12 miles from mine, and requires the kind of two-track navigation that anyone who did not grow up in this part of the UP tends to find discouraging. Jerry grew up in Luce County and has been driving two tracks his entire adult life. The drive did not slow him down. He came in his truck, parked in the clearing, and walked to the cabin without knocking, which is how he has always operated when he comes out here. I had coffee ready. I sat Jerry down at the kitchen table and turned the laptop toward him and let him watch the clips in sequence without saying anything beyond identifying what camera and what date each one was from. Jerry worked as a log scaler for a private timber company for 25 years before he retired, which means he spent most of his adult working life in and around the forests of the central UP, measuring and recording timber volume in conditions that require careful attention to what you are seeing. Jerry is not credulous. The opposite, in fact. He has a habit of proposing alternative explanations for things that sounds almost aggressive until you realize he is just working through his reasoning out loud. He watched all 11 clips. Then he went back and watched the September 21st and September 28th clips again, and the October 2nd clip 3 times. He said nothing for a while after the October 2nd clip finished. "How do you know it's the same thing?" he asked. That was his first question. I told him the proportions were consistent across all 11 clips. The height estimate was consistent, and the behavior was consistent. He watched the August 28th and September 7th clips again and agreed the proportions matched. Then he asked if I had any images with something of known size in the frame alongside the shape. I told him about the orange lath and that the lath was behind the camera position in the later clips. He was quiet again for a while. "That is a person," he said. "That has to be a person." I told him about the arms. He watched the September 28th clip again, paused it at the 1:05 mark. He was quiet for longer this time. "That is a problem," he said. He was not joking when he said it. Jerry does not make jokes about things that trouble him. He watched the October 2nd clip one more time, specifically at the section where the cabin is in the background and the shape is 7 feet from the east wall, facing the kitchen window. Then he picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. He asked me what I was going to do. Pulling all the camera cards to see what had been recorded since October 7th was the next step, and then I would decide. All 5 camera cards came out that afternoon as I walked the full property checking stand conditions, which took most of the daylight hours. Jerry went back to his place after lunch. He shook my hand before he got in the truck, which he does not typically do, and did not say anything else. The October footage from all 5 cameras covered October 7th through October 9th, the period since I had arrived. Camera 1, the East Tree Line camera, showed normal deer crossing activity on the evenings of October 7th and 8th. A doe group on the 7th, crossing east to west across the clearing at 7:22 p.m. A lone buck on the 8th, moving the same route at 6:48 p.m. No anomalous images during any of the nighttime hours on either card. Camera 4, the ridge camera, showed deer on the slope trail on the morning of October 8th, and nothing else. Camera 2, 3, and 5 were all normal. The shape did not appear in any of the October footage after October 2nd. 6 days had passed since the October 2nd clip, including 6 nights during which the cameras were running. Nothing. Whatever had been using the east clearing and the ridge above the cabin at night across 5 weeks of August and September had stopped appearing after the last image on October 2nd. I sat with that fact for a while. October 2nd was 5 days before I arrived. October 1st and October 2nd were the last 2 nights the property sat empty before I drove out on October 7th. The thing had appeared on October 1st on the ridge camera, working down the slope above the woodshed, 2:17 a.m. It had appeared on October 2nd on camera 1, 7 feet from the east wall, 2:23 a.m., and then it had not appeared again. Not on October 3rd or 4th or 5th or 6th, which were all nights the property sat empty. No truck in the clearing, no smoke from the chimney, no sign of occupancy. And not on October 7th through 9th, the nights I was actually in the cabin. I did not know how to think about that. It had approached the cabin across 5 weeks of empty property, and then stopped before I arrived. If it was avoiding me, it had stopped 4 days before I arrived, while the property was still empty. That timing makes the avoidance explanation awkward. Tracking my arrival somehow would mean it stopped too early. And if its behavior followed some pattern I could not identify, I simply did not know what that pattern was. One thing I kept returning to was the question of what the approach itself meant. The approach patterns I have documented over 9 seasons for bears, coyotes, and wolves show variation. A bear that finds a food source at a barn comes back at irregular intervals, sometimes 2 consecutive nights, sometimes with a gap of a week, depending on what else is available in the landscape. The thing in my cameras came back at very regular intervals, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always from the same 2 directions, always moving closer in a progression that had almost no variation in tempo from week to week. That regularity is what a predator does not show. A predator is flexible. It responds to the environment. The regularity I was seeing in those clips looked less like a predator and more like something executing a plan, which is a word I use reluctantly because it implies a level of intention I cannot support from camera evidence alone. What I can say from the camera evidence alone is that across 11 appearances over 5 weeks, the behavior was consistent, the timing was consistent, the approach direction was consistent, and the rate of closing distance was consistent. By my estimate, based on the image distances I had calculated, the shape was closing roughly 20 to 25 feet closer to the cabin per week. At that rate, if it had continued, it would have reached the east wall of the cabin during the first week of October. Instead, it appeared at the east wall on October 2nd, faster than the projected pace, and then stopped. I called Wayne Acker on a Monday, 10 days after I had found the clips. Wayne has been a deputy with the Luce County Sheriff's Office for 16 years, and before that he was with the Newberry City Police for 4 years. He grew up in Newberry and went to the same high school I did, though we graduated 8 years apart. I have known him my entire adult life. He is someone I trust to look at a situation without jumping to conclusions, which was what I needed. I described what I had found on the cameras and sent him 3 still frames from the clips through text message: the September 28th image and the October 2nd image and the September 9th image from camera 4. He called me back within the hour and asked if he could come out to the property. I said yes, and he drove out the following Saturday. Wayne walked the east tree line with me. I showed him the positions where the cameras had placed the shape on the August 28th clip and the September 7th clip, the near side of the maple grove where the camera was mounted. He walked the area carefully, looking at the ground, at the root systems, at the leaf litter. It was the second week of October by this point, and there had been several frosts since the October 2nd clip. Wayne pointed out, correctly, that the ground conditions had changed enough since early September that any trace evidence from those dates would have been degraded or covered by leaf fall. He was right. Physical evidence at that point was not something I expected to find. The night I first reviewed the clips, I had already looked those spots over and found nothing. Taking Wayne through the positions was about having a second trained observer walk the ground and give me his assessment. Wayne stood in the spot where the October 2nd image had placed the shape, 7 feet from the east wall of the cabin, and turned to face the kitchen window. He looked at the window for a moment, and then turned back to look at the tree line across the clearing toward the camera position. "Walk me through the whole sequence again," he said. I did. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked about trespassers, whether I had seen any sign of camp or foot traffic on the property beyond what the cameras had recorded. I had not. He asked about the Hiawatha access point nearest to the east property line. There is a 2-track on the National Forest side, about a quarter-mile east of my property line, used by hunters and snowmobilers. That is not an impossible walk from there to my east tree line. But that height, Wayne said. He had looked at the still frames. Wayne did not finish the sentence. He said he would file a report noting possible trespasser activity, and that he would have the deputies on night patrol watch the county road access point for that National Forest 2 track when they were in the area, but acknowledged there was nothing more he could do with what I had. Wayne had one more observation before he left. He said he had been a deputy in Luce County for 16 years, and in that time, he had dealt with several situations involving trespassers on private land adjacent to National Forest, including some situations involving individuals who were behaving in ways that concerned property owners significantly. In every one of those cases, he said, there was some physical evidence of the person's presence. A cigarette butt, a food wrapper, footprints in soft ground, disturbed vegetation along a route. The more frequently someone uses a piece of ground, the more evidence they leave. 11 visits to the same locations across 5 weeks should leave something he could work with. The fact that I had gone to the locations the following morning and found nothing, and that he had walked those same locations today and found nothing, with a law enforcement officer's eye for trace evidence, was notable. He said he was not claiming a person could leave nothing behind, only that finding nothing after 11 visits was unusual. The temperature issue came up too, because I had told him about it. At 31 degrees, he said, he would be producing visible breath even standing still. Cold weather training and patrol work meant he knew exactly what his own exhalation looked like in IR at close range. He watched the September 28th clip one more time on the laptop before he left, said nothing when it finished, and put on his jacket. I called 2 of my former colleagues from the DNR Newberry field office the following week. Both of them had worked in the UP longer than I had, and both of them had more experience with wildlife identification than nearly anyone else I could have called. I sent them the same 3 still frames I had sent Wayne, without providing context, beyond saying I had found something on my trail cameras that I could not identify and wanted a second opinion. My first colleague called back within 2 days. His closest comparison was a bear, based on the upright posture, and then he qualified that extensively. The arm position was wrong for a bear. The head shape was wrong for a bear. A height of 6'11" to 7'4" was outside the range of any black bear in Michigan, which top out around 6 feet on their hind legs for the largest individuals. A person could not be ruled out, he said, but the proportional issues were the same ones he was seeing. He had never encountered anything in his career he would compare it to. The second colleague called me 4 days later. He had looked at the images carefully, he said, and he had 2 thoughts. The first was that the images were consistent with a large person of atypical proportions, and that the height and arm length estimates I had provided were outside normal human range, but not biologically impossible in cases of certain connective tissue disorders that affect skeletal proportions. He mentioned Marfan syndrome, which affects body proportions including height and arm length. I had thought of that myself. A person with extreme Marfan syndrome can approach 7 feet and have limb proportions that look unusual in photographs. The syndrome does not explain 5 weeks of movement through remote forest at 2 in the morning, from 2 directions, leaving no trace and producing no breath vapor at 31 degrees. His second thought was that without better images, there was nothing definitive either of us could say. He suggested I consider reporting to the DNR's Wildlife Research Division, which maintains records of unusual wildlife encounters and trail camera documentation submitted by hunters and landowners statewide. Whether to do that was something I told him I would think about. That was more than a year ago, and I have not acted on it yet. Before the end of October, I went back to the property and added 2 additional cameras at positions where the shape had appeared repeatedly. A new cutback unit went up on the east tree line facing west, opposite from camera 1, so that anything entering the clearing from the east would be caught coming and going. Another went on the ridge slope above the cabin, angled to cover the lower slope where the October 1st clip had placed the shape. All 5 original cameras got fresh batteries and formatted cards. Everything was running before I left for the season on October 22nd. I was back at the cabin on November 15th for the opening of firearm deer season. Michigan's firearm deer season opens November 15th, and I have taken that opening week every year for as long as I can remember. I arrived in the afternoon, built a fire, and made dinner, and the following morning before I went out to hunt, I pulled all 7 camera cards and took them back to the cabin to review them before first light. The shape was not on any of them. 3 weeks of October running time on all 7 cameras, including the 2 new units at the positions the shape had specifically used. Nothing anomalous on any of the 7 cards. Normal deer activity, a bear on the north drainage camera in late October before denning up for the winter. Coyote activity on camera 5. The east clearing camera 1 had deer crossing activity on 12 separate nights across the 3-week period. Camera 4 on the ridge had consistent deer movement along the slope trail. The 2 new cameras I had added at the entity's positions showed nothing but deer and small mammals, and 1 porcupine crossing in front of the east tree line camera at 4:22 a.m. on October 28th. I sat with that for a while before putting my hunting gear on. 7 cameras running for 3 weeks at the specific locations the shape had used consistently across 5 weeks in August and September. Not one anomalous image. If the thing had continued using those positions through late October, the new cameras at those exact locations would have caught it. It had not continued using them. It had stopped, and based on the card evidence, it had stopped right around where the October 2nd clip was the last image before I arrived, and it had not returned. In late November, after the firearms season had closed and I was back in Newberry, I drove over to Sault Ste. Marie for a meeting I had arranged with a faculty member at Lake Superior State University named Ellen Marsh. I had found Dr. Marsh through a colleague who had worked with her on a riparian habitat assessment along the St. Mary's River corridor, and what made her relevant to my situation was not her ecology work, but her secondary research interest, which was the ethnoecology of the Great Lakes region, meaning the intersection of indigenous knowledge systems and the natural environment. I was aware that what I was about to describe to her would sound, on the surface, like someone asking a scientist about a paranormal encounter. That was not how I thought of it. What I had was a documented behavioral pattern from calibrated cameras across a specific time period, and I wanted to know whether anything similar had been described in the historical record of that region. Dr. Marsh is a careful thinker and a methodical one. She listened to my account, looked at the still frames, and did not dismiss anything I said. She asked several questions about the camera placement, the IR flash characteristics, the temperature logging system, and the height estimation method. When she had satisfied herself about the technical basis of the images, she said that she could not tell me what the shape in the images was. She said she wanted to be clear about that before saying anything else. She was not in a position to identify it, and she would not speculate beyond the evidence. What she could tell me, she said, was that there was a category of description in the oral traditions of several Great Lakes Ojibwe communities that bore some resemblance to the behavioral pattern I was describing. Dr. Marsh was careful in how she framed this. She said she was not claiming that what I had on camera was what indigenous oral traditions described, only noting a resemblance in the behavioral characteristics and leaving any interpretation of that resemblance to me. The resemblance was this. In a subset of Ojibwe and Anishinaabe oral traditions documented by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there are accounts of beings described as watchers or sentinels associated with transitional zones in the landscape, places where forest types change, where water meets land, where human occupation ends and wilderness begins. These beings are described in various accounts as very tall, as appearing at night, as standing motionless for extended periods, and as watching rather than acting. These beings are not consistently described as threatening, nor as protective. The description that recurs across multiple accounts is that of observers. Several of the documented accounts specify that they appear at moments of seasonal transition or at the beginning and end of periods of human activity in a place. Dr. Marsh noted that the accounts she was referencing came from a particular geographic band of territory, centered roughly on the eastern Upper Peninsula and the northern shorelines of Lakes Huron and Superior, which overlaps with Luce County. She emphasized, again, that she was not claiming that what I had photographed fit this description. She was noting that the behavioral characteristics I described, an entity appearing at a remote property at the beginning of the fall season, standing motionless and oriented toward a structure across multiple weeks, and then departing before the occupant arrived, had something in common with a category of description that had been documented in the oral traditions of people who lived in this landscape for a very long time. Whether that resemblance meant anything beyond coincidence was not something she was willing to speculate about. After thanking her, I drove back to Newbury. The drive back gave me time to think. Treating indigenous oral tradition as a literal explanation for what appeared on my cameras was not something I was inclined to do then or now. But the specific behavioral characteristics she described resonated in a way I did not want to dismiss entirely. The accounts she referenced described beings that appeared at transitional moments, at the margins between human occupation and wilderness, at the beginning and end of the periods when a place was in use. My cameras captured whatever this was across the specific 5-week period between when I set the cameras up and when I arrived to open the season. That was the transitional period. The property was not occupied. It was between its summer emptiness and its fall use. If the behavior, Dr. Marsh described, was in some way connected to that transitional quality, it would explain both the appearance and the cessation, without requiring me to believe that the thing somehow knew my specific arrival date. Before I left her office, I asked whether the traditions described these watchers as dangerous. She said the accounts were not consistent on that point. Some accounts framed them as neutral observers. Some framed them as omens of change, not threatening in themselves but associated with periods when significant events occurred. No accounts she knew of in the documented ethnographic record described these beings as directly threatening to humans. That was not a guarantee of anything, she said, because the oral traditions were partial records compiled by outside observers over a limited historical period, and the full range of community knowledge about these beings was not captured in the documented accounts. She was being appropriately careful with what she was saying, and I appreciated it. What she was offering was information, not reassurance. She gave me what she had. I have spent more time than I am comfortable admitting thinking about the question of timing. The shape appeared beginning in late August 2023, across a period when the property was empty. It appeared 11 times across 5 weeks, getting closer on a progression from the east tree line and from the ridge above. The last image was October 2nd, 5 days before I arrived. It did not appear again after October 2nd, not in the days before I arrived, and not in the 6 weeks I was at the property across October and November, not on any of the 7 cameras, including the 2 I had added specifically at its positions. There are a few ways I have tried to think about that pattern. The first is that the timing was coincidental. The shape stopped using those positions around October 2nd for reasons unrelated to my arrival, and the fact that I arrived 5 days later was not causally connected to the cessation. Under this interpretation, the 5-week approach toward the cabin was also coincidental, meaning the shape's progressive movement from the tree line toward the cabin across 5 weeks was not intentional movement toward the cabin, but rather reflected some other pattern. I cannot identify that happened to produce images that look like an approach. I do not find that interpretation convincing. The images from cameras 1 and 4 are too consistent across too many weeks to be coincidental drift. The second interpretation is that the shape's behavior was associated with the property's empty period, specifically the period between the last human use and the first fall occupation. Under this interpretation, whatever it was doing at this cabin across 5 weeks in August and September was something it did at unoccupied structures during the seasonal gap, and it stopped when the property's status changed in some way it could detect before my arrival. This interpretation would explain the cessation before I arrived if the thing detected some preparation, some change in the property's condition in the days before October 7th that told it the empty period was ending. I drove a load of gear out to the cabin on October 4th and left it locked up, intending to come back on the 7th. That would have been visible sign of upcoming occupation. I do not know if that is relevant. The third possibility is the one I cannot dismiss and do not want to consider too closely, which is that it was aware of my individual arrival in a way that gave it accurate advance information. 5 days is a specific number, not 2 weeks out, not the night before. I cannot explain how that precision would be possible, and I have no evidence for it. It is the interpretation I keep returning to. I went back to the cabin in February 2024 to check for any winter damage and pull the camera cards that had been running since I left in late November. 7 cameras, roughly 3 months of winter running time. I went through all 7 cards in one long, sitting at the kitchen table with a fire in the fissure and coffee on the propane stove. Normal winter activity across all 7 cameras. Deer using the trails through November and into early December before the deep snow pushed them toward the browse areas. A wolf pack moved through on the night of December 14th. 4 animals traveling single file through the east clearing on camera 1. The lead animal's track registered in a soft patch of snow at the south edge of camera 1's frame. A large print with the characteristic forefoot to hindfoot registration of a wolf, moving at a steady trot. I noted it because wolves in Luce County have been documented but are not common, and this was the first pack I had on camera at this property. Coyote activity, porcupine, red squirrel, a mink working the creek drainage on 3 separate nights in January. The 2 cameras I had set up at the entity's positions were full of small mammal activity and nothing else. No anomalous images on any of the 7 cards, nothing resembling August and September. I went back in April 2024 to open camp for the spring and pulled the remaining winter-spring cards, normal spring activity. A black bear passed the north drainage camera on April 7th, the first bear I had captured in that location since the previous fall. Nothing anomalous. 7 cameras have been running on that property since the fall of 2023. Cards get pulled and reviewed on a regular schedule through the fall of 2024 and into the winter. Not one additional image of the shape has turned up. Whatever it was doing at my cabin across 5 weeks in the fall of 2023, it has not returned. At least not in a way that the cameras have detected. I still hunt the property. I was there for the October 2024 archery season and the November firearm season, and I intend to be there again this year. The cabin is what my father built it to be, and it belongs to me, and I am not going to stop using it because of something I cannot explain. That is not something a series of night images changes. But I sleep differently than I used to. Not badly, most of the time. The sleep is not troubled. It is just different. When I wake up in the loft at 2 in the morning and the cabin is dark and quiet and the clearing is outside the gable window, I am aware of the clearing in a way I was not aware of it before. The cameras have shown me what uses that clearing in the hours between 2 and 4 a.m. in the fall when the property sits empty. On the 2nd of October 2023, something arrived at the east wall. 7 feet from the kitchen window, facing that window, for 30 seconds in 3-4 degree air without producing any visible breath vapor. In the dark, at 2:23 in the morning. The images are on my laptop. 11 clips, all time-stamped. All with temperature logs from the camera's internal sensor. All on a camera that I have used for 9 seasons and that has never produced images I could not explain before. The images are on my laptop and they will stay there. What they contain is something I cannot identify. What they do not contain is any explanation I have been able to find in more than a year of looking. The cameras are still running. I will pull the cards again in October. There is one more thing I need to describe. In early September 2024, a year after the first anomalous image appeared on my cameras, I drove out to the property to do pre-season camera maintenance and set up for the upcoming October opener. I drove out in the afternoon, cleared a small amount of blowdown that had come across the 2-track, checked the cabin, and walked the 5 original camera positions plus the 2 I had added the previous fall. When I got to the maple at camera 1, the east tree-line camera, I stopped and stood in the clearing for a while. It was about 3 in the afternoon, sunny, mid-50s. The maple grove was still in full leaf and the east tree line was a solid green wall on that side of the clearing. I was standing approximately where the October 2nd image had shown the shape, 7 feet from the east wall of the cabin, facing the kitchen window. I looked at the window from that position. The single-pane glass from 1978, slightly wavy at the edges, reflecting the afternoon light. I stood there and I tried to understand what anything would be looking at from that position. What information you would be getting from standing at that spot for 30 seconds at 2:23 in the morning. The window gives you a view into the kitchen interior, the table, the stove, the ladder to the loft. In October, with the lantern lit, you would see clearly into the cabin from outside. You would see whether anyone was home. You would see where they were sitting and whether they were awake or asleep. After a few minutes, I moved on. Camera maintenance done, battery replaced, card formatted. I walked back to the cabin, made a sandwich, and drove home to Newberry before dark. Dorothy asked how the property looked. I told her it looked good. Everything was in order. The The cameras were up and running. She asked if I was going to be okay out there this fall, and I told her yes, which is true. I am 58 years old, and that property was my father's before mine. I am not going to let something I cannot explain change the relationship I have with that land. But when she asked the question, I noticed that I had to think about my answer for a moment before I gave it. That is something that was not true of me before the fall of 2023. I did not used to have to think about whether I was going to be okay out there.